we are coming to the closing session. So we're coming to the long chain of events. And I'm really very thankful for everyone who is in the Zoom right now, listening the closing part of the TNDS. I'm hoping that everything is alive and you can hear me very well. Okay, today it's a really very exciting day for us. For those who didn't have a chance to meet our final keynote speaker, it will be really very interesting for us to know also more about the speaker itself. And why? It's because of Erin come to us during the COVID. It's a time when it's very hard to make a connection, hard to meet people, hard to learn. She already won all the hearts and minds and hearts of our students. She's already serving on multiple thesis committees. Students coming to Erin's classes, they're talking about climate change. They're talking about different things what Erin can do. And we are reading different information on newspapers and in newsletters. So where Erin in the world? So in which part of the world she is conquered right now? She is very well traveled. She knows so much about the climate, how it's related to food, how it's related to environment. And for us, it's extremely important to learn how to put all the pieces together. So without any long introduction, it's very informal. Please tell more about yourself. Please tell more about the study. And for everyone who is in the room, please wait for a little bit. We will put the questions together at the end, and we will allow also people to ask many questions. Okay, I'm passing the microphone to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And thanks for the warm welcome. It's so good to be here. And I have to say, that was very kind. It's been such a joy to get to work with all of you, really, and very inspiring. I have to say, I come home talking about like, oh my gosh, I learned so much about maple trees today, or I learned so much about a variety of things from getting to work with all of you, in particular, the student body here at Friedman, which is really inspirational. So thank you. And thanks to everybody for sticking around. I think I have the tough job of being a Friday 5 p.m. speaker. So we'll see how this goes. I'd love to make it a little bit interactive, but I know we are limited in our ability to interact with people on Zoom. So we'll do our best, but maybe what I'll try to do is end early enough that we could have a bit of an interactive question and answer rather than try to talk to you as I go. So, is there a clicker? No, I can just push it over here. So, right, more about myself. That's what you asked. My name is Erin Coughlan de Perez. I am a climate scientist by training. So that's my background, is really thinking about the atmosphere and extreme events and how can we predict them and how can we model them? And in particular, how can we adapt and deal with extreme events as they happen? So my career has been mostly in the humanitarian sector. I worked with the Red Cross, Red Crescent Climate Center for many years, looking at how we can manage extreme events, changing risk of extreme events, and in particular, set up early warning systems, which I'll talk about in more detail as a deep dive in this talk. So the point I'd love to make today, my major take-home point, is that climate change is not something of the future. We live in a changed climate. The climate of 2023 is different from the climate of 1950. And sometimes I think we get a little bit, we think about climate change as a future far off problem. But my argument today is going to be that we are fundamentally not understanding the fact that our risk today is different from the past. And some of our tools are a little bit too focused on the past. So what I'm going to talk about is first, my thesis that I think we're suffering from a lack of imagination. The world has changed around us, and we're maybe not imagining quite how much that has changed. Number two, we are adapting. People are managing to live in this changed climate, managing to change their practices and thrive. But this is slower and more limited than we would hope. And I'll talk about some research into assessing that. And then last, I'll talk about early warning systems as a method for managing changing risks over time, because this has been a strong focus of some of my research. So first, a lack of imagination. I've got 3 points for you here. One is looking at some existing research. What does most research tell us about climate risk? And how do we do that? What are some operational questions in comparison that people are really asking these days? And what are some novel methods that we could use to try to answer that? And because this is a data symposium, I'm going to talk about big data sets. So most research looks at the past. When we want to understand the relationship between A and B, we look at the past and we say, how was A related to B in the past? Including some of my own research, right? So here's an example of a study I did in East Africa on pastoral systems, trying to understand in the past, how has rainfall been related to food security outcomes? So this is we've got here phase of food insecurity. 1 is food secure and 5 is famine. And the probability of ending up in each of those categories does shift contingent on rainfall. And so the brown is lower rainfall and the green is higher rainfall for the purposes of understanding this plot. So basically, you can see that we said historically, more rainfall tends to increase people's chances of having higher food security in this region. Now, this is limited by the fact that it was a historical relationship. And so when we actually think about this, we wonder, are we not fully representing what is possible? What would happen if rainfall occurred that was different than anything we've experienced in the past? How would that play out in that type of figure? And this is the kind of operational question that we're getting right now from disaster managers. So I talked to American Red Cross, who would like to really become a leader in climate change adaptation. They recognize that climate is affecting their work all the time and the disasters that they respond to on an ongoing basis. And they said, okay, so we had this first call and they said, okay, Erin, imagine that you're me, a disaster manager in American Red Cross in California in the year 2013, 10 years ago. And you are trying to plan for fires in the coming 10 years. How do you make your plans? You make them based on the fires that you've seen in the past and your understanding of what happened in the past, which if you have been following any news over the past decade, you'll remember that the fires that we've seen in the last 10 years have been bigger and fundamentally different from fires of the past. And they said to me, how in the world can we anticipate that kind of fundamental change in other parts of the country in the next 10 years? What tools do we have to expand our imagination and prepare for things that are really fundamentally different and maybe unprecedented? So, one way that we're trying to tackle this in collaboration with American Red Cross and others is by using some novel methods. So I'm going to talk about a study that was actually just accepted for publication yesterday. So this will come out soon, where we look, and in this case, I won't be talking about disasters for the American Red Cross, but I'll be talking about disasters for wheat. So this was actually a student-led idea. Hamsa Ganapathy who graduated last year, had this idea that she wanted to look into wheat in Kansas. So she did an independent study and we started on this cool research project together, which we eventually published, including Tim, for example, as one of the co-authors who knows a lot more about agriculture than I do. So that was the question. The question was, what kind of unseen events and what kind of risk has changed over time in this region, even if we haven't maybe experienced it yet? So maybe our risk of extreme heat waves is a lot higher these days, even if we haven't maybe seen one materialize, right? Because extreme events are by definition extreme and not very common. So what we did was we used a large ensemble, an archive of many, many, many runs of the current climate. So we take a climate model that has the physics of the atmosphere that basically says, if you put in these inputs, here's how the atmosphere will run, and it will generate this kind of weather and this kind of temperature, and then we do it again, and we do it again, and again, hundreds and hundreds of times until we have a big ensemble of possible iterations of our current world. And this is our way of expanding our imagination and creating larger data sets to be able to look at very extreme and very statistically low probability events. So what did we find in this region? Here is an example. So we identified a threshold temperature at which wheat tends to suffer enzyme breakdown. And so here are the number of days in the growing period where wheat in this particular region of the Midwest would be experiencing temperatures above that sort of threshold level. So you can see we ran, over here is a few hundred iterations of the world of 1981 in the gray box plot, and the blue X is what happened in 1981. And then we ran again, 1982, few hundred iterations of what could have happened, like what could the world have looked like in 1982, and blue is what actually did happen. So you can see over time, we've built up this big ensemble of possible worlds. And you can see that some of these possible worlds generate temperatures or experiences that are very, very outside the realm of what has ever been experienced. And what do you notice? There's also absolutely a trend in this particular region, which would be consistent, of course, with maybe what we would expect from a warming climate in that region. So why is this interesting? We have gotten a little bit lucky. If you look at the recent years and you look at the blue X's in recent years, we have not experienced really statistically improbable, very high temperature heat events in this region. But that doesn't mean it's not possible. And in fact, these things are much more likely these days than they were back in 1980. The farmer who's just remembering what has actually happened, who only knows the blue X's, might not be preparing for these really statistically improbable events that are much more likely than they were in the past. So we quantified this. This is a plot of return periods. So the 1 in 100, so in gray, in dotted lines, you can see our estimates of our best estimate of return periods based on the observational record alone, with very wide confidence intervals in that sort of light shading. And then you can see, using our very large ensemble, we have sort of narrowed estimates of what is the return period in this region. In gray is the return period estimates for 1981, and in red are the return period estimates for 2020. So this is not the future. I'm not showing you anything about the future. This is today. So our estimate for what used to be a 1 in 100 year event, temperature event in this region, has now become something that would happen on average every 6 years. The probability of a record-breaking event, an event that goes higher than anything observed in the historical record every year right now in this region, according to our calculations, is 17%. And so if you're just thinking about the past, you're fundamentally missing what could be possible today. So this was our message coming out of this paper. And we also noted that it's not just extreme heat, but extreme heat is very much associated with extreme dryness, partly because of how the atmosphere works, right? It's to get extreme heat events, you also get a lot of dry. So if you have a lot of very strongly dry event, it can get very, very hot because of the feedback loops with the earth. So we even created some plots. We did this in the paper, also includes a wheat producing region of China. And we created some plots of what kind of, these are some of the biggest extremes in our ensemble, to say what kind of weather patterns would cause this? What do we need to be looking out for? What would this look like dynamically if it were to happen? And we could look at, what kind of weather patterns could cause extreme heat and drought in both regions simultaneously, and start talking about getting ready for that kind of event. And then I'd just like to say, that this approach, I think, has a lot of potential. There are some students, one of whom is in the audience, who are currently using this for a directed study this semester to investigate their own research questions, looking at how other sort of important variables have changed over time, how have the return periods changed over time, and what kind of risk might exist today that we might not necessarily be aware of. We're also doing this in collaboration with the American Red Cross in some of the regions that they're very interested in. So that's the point on lack of imagination. I hope I've convinced you that we need to be thinking well beyond the historical record these days. Second point would be that adaptation is happening. People are adapting to climate change. And I'm going to make just two quick notes on this via some other research about whether or not that adaptation is really transforming society and whether or not we're seeing a lot of equity. You might have your guess about what the answer to those two questions are, but I'll tell you in a minute. So here are some examples of categories of adaptation that we created. I was one of the authors of the IPCC report that was released last year. So we created a whole bunch of categories of different types of adaptation that we're seeing around the world. So, diversifying livelihoods, creating new building codes, coastal infrastructure, for example, for sea level rise, et cetera, et cetera. You'll see there are tons and tons and tons of cool ways that society is trying to deal with a changing climate. And we said, okay, well, we don't really have a good catalog of where and when this is happening. So we did a systematic literature review of published papers that talk about climate change adaptation. And so this literature review included only peer-reviewed publications that documented adaptation happening, no theory of what should happen. There are a lot of papers about theory, but documentation of what really did happen. So we ended up after removing duplicates with 48,000, and we did screening, and then we had 2 people screen every full text article and code it to understand what we were seeing in this database of adaptation responses. And so what I'll note, one of the questions we had was, are these transformational? Are they really changing the world we live in, or are they really just making small changes on the margins, right? So I'm going to plant my crop 1 week earlier, but I'm going to basically do the exact same thing as I did before. Or I'm going to radically change my farming system or move out of farming, which would be much more transformational, right? So we coded all of these articles, this big database, and the answer is very little transformation. The whole point of this plot is just to say, evidence of transformational adaptation, the light green color is low. And in most regions, for most sectors, we find the answer is really low. We're seeing a lot of incremental approaches. I would also note that there are some big equity considerations when it comes to adaptation. Oh, right, this is about transformation. That's my comic for you, which I love. I think one of the studies that we did with this database is about extreme heat and how people are adapting to extreme heat. And so what's kind of interesting, you'll notice here, especially for a nutrition audience, is that most of the papers talking about extreme heat impacts on health were found in wealthy countries, and very few of those papers were found in lower income countries or in the global south. Heat impacts on agriculture were discussed in those regions, but we are seeing a big bias where heat impacts on health is not well researched in the global south. And then I would also note we did a sub-study looking at conflict-affected regions, places that are experiencing conflict. Climate change doesn't skip those places because people are busy. Yemen is a great example. Yemen really is, struggling with a lot. There's a lot of chaos happening. And then cyclones hit Yemen, or heat waves, or drought, or high temperatures. And so our point here was just looking specifically at countries that have been conflict affected for many years. What kind of literature do we see in those places? And one, you might not be surprised that there is not so much written about it. How are people dealing with climate in those regions? And number two, the literature is predominantly about agriculture and food. There's not a lot about health-related adaptation in these places, which is a big concern certainly from an equity point of view. All right. So then my last point for you is a deep dive into one type of adaptation, which is something that I work on very closely, which is early warning systems. So my thesis with early warning system, so I'll talk about use cases, talk about nutrition, and transdisciplinary collaboration. So early warning systems, the whole point of this is, let's imagine we're going to have an unprecedented heat wave that could happen these days. You're going to get a warning for it in most places. Imagine the Pacific Northwest heat wave that broke all records a few years ago. That was forecasted, right? People did raise the alarm and did have a chance to start doing something before the heat wave materialized. So this can be a critical tool in our toolbox for managing extreme events, especially extremes that we've never seen before. If we can get the warning before they happen, we can often get people out of the way or protect valuable assets before they happen. This is, of course, one adaptation among many, but this is where I'll do the deep dive. So here we made a plot you can see that this is a projected temperature increase. So this is future. I've now moved on to the future. Projected temperature increase around the world. And I've hatched places that have really very accurate weather forecasts for heat waves. So if we're seeing an increase in temperature over time, but we actually have really good early warnings for heat waves, we should be able to save lives. We should be able to protect people before, during those events as they come, and we shouldn't be surprised by them. We should be ready to take action. So the use cases of early warning systems are more than just heat waves. This is a picture of all the chapters in that IPCC report that came out last year. So this is a big intergovernmental report on climate change. I'm curious, you'll see there is an introduction chapter, there are a whole bunch of sectoral chapters, regional chapters, and then a few concluding chapters at the end. There are 18 total. How many do you think mentioned early warning systems as an adaptation to climate change? One, I'm getting 0, 1, 0, 3. I feel like I haven't been very convincing. The answer is 18, all of them. So now I feel like I failed in convincing you that this is a very important thing because, wow, thanks, Will. This small vote of confidence, you might have been the highest with your vote of 4. All of them, right? People are using early warning systems for marine heat waves, for fish capture. They're using them for food security, using it for health, obviously, I mentioned. I mean, we have the ability to use these short-term forecasts for all sorts of things around the world. And so my point here is just that we can use short-term information, even if long-term climate information is somewhat general, generally gives you a direction of trend. We can build up our capacity to take action in the short term to really prevent extreme events from causing major damage. So in part of this, I'm working with an amazing group of people in the Academic Alliance for Anticipatory Action. So this is a consortium with Tufts University and 4 African universities and 2 Asian universities to study anticipatory action using early warning systems. So we co-authored the paper that had that earlier plot, the blue world plot that I just showed you. So this group is starting to say, well, how can we use early warning systems effectively? What are the most effective actions we could take? If you have a cyclone that's bearing down on a country, can you give people cash in advance? Could you give people in Florida gas cards to help them drive out of the way? Or what is it that we can do that would be very effective and beneficial? And what kind of forecast should we be using to do this? So I'm going to talk about one study that this consortium is working on, which is looking specifically at anticipatory action relating to nutrition in Somalia. So Somalia has currently is living through a multi-season drought that might have been one of the longest on record. I mean, it's just shockingly dry for a shockingly long time. Season after season has had failed rains. But many of these failed rains, if not most of these failed seasons, were predicted because we had La Nina over the last few years. The Pacific Ocean was cooler than usual in certain places, which allows us to forecast rainfall around the world. And we said, heads up, Somalia is very, very likely to be dry. It's not a perfect forecast, but it can at least give some sort of warning. Given that, and given information that people had about all sorts of other factors, there were lots of warnings about food insecurity for Somalia, not just based on the weather, but plenty of warnings. So OCHA, the Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, released some funding in an anticipatory way to enable cash transfers in Somalia. And their theory was, let's do this earlier based on these warnings than we otherwise might have. This was a small pilot, frankly, a little bit of a drop in the bucket, but they were trying to do this and trying to use this proof of concept. So they started to work with us to understand, did we see improved food security outcomes during the drought after that the cash transfer was made? And so I'll just show you one plot where I'm working. So one of my colleagues, Komal here at Friedman School, has been doing a complex econometric analysis of people who received the cash transfers and people who didn't, and using propensity score matching to understand how we can analyze the differences between these two groups and whether or not the group that received the cash transfers showed an improvement in outcomes over time. So here's a bit of a timeline. The cash transfers happened you can see where the line starts to go up in May-ish. It was actually a longer intervention that happened somewhere between May and the following few months. And you can see this is what I'm plotting here are regression coefficients between the recipient group and the comparison group. So this is some work that Komal and others are leading and we're pulling together right now. But what you can see is that in most cases, we are seeing an improvement in reported food consumption among people who received this early assistance as they went through the drought. The other big note that we're struggling with here, though, is that it does seem to be fleeting. This doesn't seem to be a long-term solve everything benefit. And we are advocating that in addition to this early action, people need ongoing support through these many, many, many failed rainy seasons. So my last point in talking about early warning systems and talking about adaptation and research and trying to make a difference is about transdisciplinary collaboration. And I just wanted to end with a quick story. You can see that throughout this talk, I've been talking about a number of different methods, from analysis of weather data from large ensembles of climate forecasts to analysis of peer-reviewed papers, for example, with that GAMI study, to this last one, which is econometric methods. This field requires everyone. It requires everyone's input and often requires really uncomfortable transdisciplinary work. And so I worked for many years, and I still am affiliated with the Red Cross Red Crescent Climate Center. And the story I want to tell you is about our efforts in doing transdisciplinary work to promote anticipatory action in the Red Cross. So we were pushing this idea. We said, look, there are weather forecasts out there. We want to be able to use them. And traditionally, the Red Cross and other humanitarian organizations receive donations after the event. If there is a horrible event, people learn about it, they donate, or they allocate some funding, and the humanitarians can go in and help. It's usually a very delayed process, frankly. We said, we want you to be able to do this pre-disaster based on a forecast. There was a lot of interest in this, and we had to convince everyone. You needed the economic analysis to convince the donors, you needed the forecast analysis to convince the weather people. And then we had a whole bunch of social science people working on what kind of actions should be taken. And we eventually convinced, originally it was the government of Germany and the International Federation of Red Cross Red Crescent to say, okay, we're going to work together and we're going to create a fund that will allocate money based on a forecast. Forecast comes, you get the money, you take your early action, and we hope for the best. So I had thought that we covered all the bases. I thought, great, this is like social science, natural science, economics, everybody was involved. This is going to be so great. And we, the donor had signed off on this, perfect. And then someone called me up one day and said, Erin, I need you to talk to someone. We have a problem. And I was like, what's our problem? And they said, the Red Cross legal department says that we're not allowed to do this. And I said, well, what do you mean? Like, someone's giving us money to do this. Everyone says this is fine. What do you mean the legal department has said no? And they said, yeah, well, we're not legally allowed to take money and give it out based on a forecast. For these like complex legal reasons that I don't need to bore you with. My whole point was we then had to spend a whole lot longer, and they've turned out to be one of our biggest hurdles in making this happen. And so my point about transdisciplinary collaboration is that it really does take everyone. And if you think you're thinking wide, you often need to think wider. But that's really, I think, how we're going to get there. And what's been really quite inspirational about this week, seeing all the different talks from so many different disciplines and bringing together so many different ideas to tackle a lot of aspects relating to nutrition. So my final point then is this call to action. Solid research with broad imagination. That would be my hope for us as we move forward tackling climate change and many of the other pressing problems of our day. And I think that one of the greatest examples of this is what you're going to do next, which is this hackathon to look at nutrition, right? And modeling nutrition and famine around the world from so many different perspectives. So this is the diagram from the Famine and Food Crisis Forecasting Center, starting to demonstrate how they're thinking holistically about this problem and how we can collaborate from a lot of different angles in really pushing this agenda forward in a transformative way, in a way that goes beyond, small learning on the edges, but how can we really make a big change? So I'm really excited to see what happens next with the hackathon. I hopefully have enough time now. I can stop for some questions and a bit more interaction, and then we'll turn it over to the hackathon. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. And yes, we will try to make it more proactive. We will make it a little bit more interesting and unusual. I don't really see many questions on the chat. So people who are on the Zoom, please try to do whatever you want to do with your questions. And we will be looking forward to see yours. And I am definitely have questions now from the audience as well. So you have a chance to ask whatever questions you have. You raise your hand, you come to the podium, I will pass the microphone, and I can count to 3, or I can ask my question. Oh, yes, absolutely. We have questions.
Yes. Well, so we have a question in the chat, and I'll go ahead and read it. As environmental changes are making certain regions unlivable or uncomfortable to live in, what kinds of changes are you seeing in human migration? As an inevitable result of migration, can you also speak to whether cultural changes and clashes are being explored or considered in climate change research? That seems like a big question.
Yeah, sure. Actually, can I give it to you? You and I were just talking about this, and this has been a really core focus of your research. No, really, could I ask you to give a couple lines answer, and then I can add for sure?
Okay. Well, in terms of what type of changes we're seeing in migration, I do think that there's a common assumption that people tend to leave affected areas. And I think what we're seeing is that in a lot of cases, that's not true. And there's these vulnerable populations that tend to get left behind. And we're seeing that in Indonesia, I think that, people are adapting and they choose to stay for many, many reasons. And so they live in these areas where, they're being afflicted regularly by extreme events and not leaving. And I think that's all I can speak to on that.
No, that's great. And I think your research is really interesting and groundbreaking in that area. I think basically, I think the link between climate and migration is very, very complicated. And often climate change prevents migration because people do get, what we call trapped populations, or they're unable to leave, or they don't want to. And I think that anyone who's taken my class in the fall, we've talked about this quite a lot. My big take home message is that we need to be very, very, very careful about any assumptions that we make. If we assume that such and such event is going to cause such and such group of people to migrate, I would be very careful about that assumption. And there are some really interesting papers. There were some people who made a lot of assumptions around a drought that preceded the Syria uprising a number of years ago, back in 2011. So the drought preceded this uprising. And people said, oh, well, it must have been because the drought caused people weren't able to work on farms, and then they moved to cities, and therefore they were bored and just happened to do an uprising, which is a really horrible narrative. I mean, it just doesn't acknowledge the fact that people had reasons for wanting to do this, right? They said, we're living under a horrible situation, and we are revolting against a dictator for a lot of fundamental reasons. And papers that have been published since have shown that there does not seem to be any evidence of a mass migration of people to cities after that drought. And in fact, agriculture in the year after the drought seemed to be pretty regular and normal. And then, of course, the uprisings were after that. So I would be very, very careful with that logic. Not that it can't happen, obviously, but that we should make no assumptions and be careful about, if we are making assumptions, how might that feel to people who we're assuming things about? Yeah. Oh, great. Go ahead. Do they know there's
Alex? Yeah, Alex Thorne.
Hi.
Alex. Yeah.
Oh, hi.
Yes. Hi, Erin.
Hi.
I've seen variations on this talk a couple times now, and something really clicked for me this time, that now I'm really getting what the ensemble model was doing in terms of it's simulated, but it's the past. I'm curious about that approach and whether it is taken to be like absolutely more reliable to do kind of a past looking ensemble model as opposed to some sort of climate forecast. Like do these past simulations are necessarily seen as more trustworthy than something maybe looking 10 years into the future, for example?
Great question. So people are doing both. So they are running SMILES. I forget exactly how you call this, but large ensembles into the future. The problem is it requires a huge amount of processing power, and it's just a big endeavor. So the approach we're using mines data from seasonal forecasting that's already available, that's been created for the past. So that's, I think, partly why it's very useful. In terms of which one might be more accurate, I think, I don't know. You sort of have to evaluate your model as you go, and models might work well in certain places for certain characteristics and not as well for other regions in other characteristics. So I don't think there's maybe a hard and fast rule there. What I can say is, in the past, the stuff we're doing that looks at current risk and compares it to past risk, you can evaluate your model against observations. For the future, the problem is, if you've got a big model and you've got 300 simulations of the year 2050, it's sometimes hard to know if those simulations are crazy or if literally our climate might be crazy in 2050, right? Do you trust the behavior of the model if it looks strange, or say, no, my model is inaccurate, and that's why it's producing this strange behavior? It's a little bit easier to know how to say that for the past than for the future.
Any other questions in the audience? Can I ask you questions? My favorite provocative one, when it's come to the early warning, how early is early? How late is late? When is the right time? And what is the issue of time and scale?
So what we've advocated for in our approach is matching the correct action with the correct warning. So if you have high probability right before the event, you want to be evacuating or whatever. If you've got low probability a week in advance, maybe you're pre-positioning supplies. And so making that match, I think, is the most obvious way to do it. And so a lot of our forecast verification work allows people to help make that match because they'll know how good is the warning at the moment they're looking at it. I would say the most extreme example I've ever seen is Mexico City is prone to earthquakes. I don't do earthquake early. You can't really warn for earthquakes, right? I work only in the atmosphere. I don't work below ground. But I think this example is very interesting, that if you have an earthquake that happens and the epicenter is not exactly on Mexico City, you have some time as the earthquake travels through the ground to reach the city. So Mexico City has a super well-developed series, sirens, and everyone knows what action they're supposed to take, where they're supposed to go, where are the safe places, and the sirens are very active. So if there is an earthquake off the coast or somewhere else in the country, they will run those sirens and people will take action with 1 minute of warning, maybe even 2 minutes. And they'll use that time to save lives, which is, I think, really remarkable and requires a lot of upfront investment to be able to act on a minute's notice. But then we see things as far back as, months and months for that Somalia example.
But it also means like sometimes you can use this type of ideas and you can apply it to different things. Like if you know that this happens, earthquake happens, you know that aftershock will follow. And after the aftershock, you might have more chances to be prepared for that as well. So like thinking about cascading events or more complex events as well. I see there is another questions.
Also tsunamis, right?
Also tsunamis, yeah, for sure. You can have that kind of early warning. We were reading about that. And in the complex hazard point, I think is really good. Someone just sent me an email about Hurricane Ida that hit Louisiana. Seems like the bigger issue was that after Hurricane Ida went through, there was a heat wave. And that heat wave killed so many people because the power was out. Mm-hmm. And so these compound disasters are again, this is maybe a failure of imagination, right? Can we even conceive of hurricane followed by heat wave? Can we start planning for things that are so extreme and crazy that require very different thinking and new protocols?
Absolutely. And for sometimes if for hurricane will come at the time which is unusual, it's not like when unexpected or very early in the season or very late in the season. I think that there are so many interesting points which, we can make, as you said, if we will broaden our imagination. Right. Any other comments, points? I don't want to hack the audience because I can easily ask more questions. Any comments? I think that we cover a lot of issues, a lot of questions, a lot of points. Thank you very much, Erin. It's fantastic presentation. Thank you very much for the audience.